Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the brave crew that arrived on a Friday afternoon for Unpacking PPP Forgiveness as best as we can, PPP Flexibility Act. We're going to ask that you please post your questions in the Q&A only and avoid the chat. We only have one moderator today, and she's not going to be able to work through the chat. So please, if you want your questions answered, put them in the chat, and we'll answer questions after the presentation. There are a lot of people on here today. A recording of this webinar and slides will be posted shortly on our community site at realtime.inc.com. And later in the day, we will also email a copy of the slides to the participants. A little bit about myself. I am the founder and CEO of Multifunding. I'm an Inc. columnist writing about business lending issues. I've advised prior administrations on the business credit markets as well as the Federal Reserve Bank. I have a book out called The Growth Dilemma. And for my EO friends out there, I'm a proud EO board member of EO Philadelphia. My lawyers asked me to read that we are in an unprecedented time in history, and the information available to us is changing rapidly. Please refer to our most current presentation for education. The information provided is based upon our best judgment about what we know at this time. However, key questions remain about how to implement this program. Multifunding LLC does not accept any liability as it relates to the timeliness or content of the information we are sharing today or may share in the future, and we are under no legal duty to update any such information or recommendations. We encourage you to check in with your attorneys, CPAs, and financial advisors for additional insights. Before we start, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give you some context. This is a confusing mess. Yes, new legislation was signed by the president today. The legislation and the bill is about 4 pages, but it is going to take dozens of pages of guidance and interpretation to answer the questions that you likely have for me today. Please don't be upset and disappointed. Most questions are not able to be answered. What I can provide you today is the structure of the changes in the PPP Forgiveness and Flexibility Act, but the devil is in the detail, and there's a lot of detail that we simply do not know the answers to. So we will take some questions at the end, but please keep in mind that unfortunately, there are not yet good answers to most of your questions. We will provide updated Ominars like this today as necessary when useful information changes. We're trying to update you along the way, but there's still a lot that we do not know. So let's dig into what we do know about the PPP Flexibility Act and what changes it makes. First of all, for anyone who has not applied for a PPP loan yet and is waiting, as of right now, you have until June 30th, 2020 to do it, and then the PPP program shuts off. For anyone who gets a new PPP loan today going forward until June 30th, those loans will now automatically amortize over 5 years instead of over 2 years. For PPP loans, the 4 million or something that are already out there, borrowers and lenders can mutually agree to extend previously issued PPP loans if it makes sense. They have the right to do so. The payment deferment period. Currently, on the current PPP loans, the deferment period, there's no payments for 6 months. In the new law, that has been extended to whenever the forgiveness decision is finalized. However, if you do not apply for forgiveness within 10 months of your covered period, payments will automatically begin. The covered forgiveness period is now extended from 8 weeks to 24 weeks, and the final deadline is December 31st. Borrowers can opt in, if you want to keep your 8-week period. What is the difference between 8 versus 24? Well, 24 weeks increases the time you can use the money and have your loan forgiven. It also increases the period over which you must maintain your FTE level and avoid a reduction in salary and wages. So that is a trade-off that you have to decide upon. There are safe harbor deadlines to when you have to restore your payroll and the pay levels have moved from June 30th to December 31st. However, there are two good faith tests. You have to demonstrate your inability to rehire employees who were employed on February 15th, 2020. And this is new, your inability to hire similarly qualified employees for unfilled positions by December 31st, 2020. It is no longer simply enough just to try and rehire an old employee. You need to make an effort to replace them in order to get the safe harbor benefit. Some exceptions are made. When you cannot find qualified employees for open positions, this could be due to concerns over safety requirements, etc. And when you cannot restore your operations to previous levels due to social distancing, sanitation, or customer safety needs. These requirements will be set by the Department of Health and Human Services, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or OSHA. To be 100% forgiven, you must spend 100% of your loan proceeds on payroll expenses and eligible proceeds during the eligible period included rent, utilities, or interest on your building. And your FTE and certain salaries and wages on December 31st must equal those on February 15th. The new ratios are such that 60% of your forgiveness application can now be for payroll and the other 40% for other forgivable expenses, rent, utilities, or interest on your building. If you spend less than 60% on payroll, none of the loan is eligible for forgiveness. And in the new legislation, participants in the PPP can also defer 50% of their employer payroll expenses until 2021 and the other half until 2022. Let me share with you some helpful prior information, but none of this is new. EIDL advances, if you received in advance, this amount will be reduced from your final forgiveness amount, and that amount will become a loan payable. Remember, when you took this loan, you agreed to, irrespective of whether or not the money is forgiven, you only agree to use the loan for eligible payroll costs, rent, interest, or your mortgage or utilities. It is imperative that you keep methodical records of your expenses. Allowable payroll costs for forgiveness include compensation to employees in the form of salary, wages, commissions, or similar compensation, cash tips or the equivalent, based on an employer records of past tips, or in the absence of such records, a reasonable good faith employer estimate of such tips, and payment for vacation, parental, family, medical, or sick leave. Allowable payroll costs for forgiveness include allowance for separation or dismissal, payment for the provision of employee benefits consisting of group healthcare coverage, including insurance premiums and retirement, payment of state and local taxes assessed on compensation of employees, and for an independent contractor or sole proprietor, wages, commissions, income or net earnings from self-employment, or similar compensation. What is not included is any compensation of employee whose principal place of residence is not in the United States. The compensation of an individual employee in excess of an annual salary of $100,000 is not included. Federal employment taxes imposed or withheld between February 15th, 2020 and June 30th, 2020, and likely later in the new legislation are also not included. And qualified sick and family leave wages, for which a credit is allowed under Section 7001 and 7003 of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, are also not included. Some payroll nuances. Payroll costs are considered paid on the day that paychecks are distributed or the borrower originates an ACH credit transaction. Payroll costs are considered incurred on the day that the employee's pay is earned. And payroll costs incurred but not paid during the borrower's last pay period of the covered period are eligible for forgiveness if paid on or before the next regular payroll date. Remember that for each individual employee, the total amount of cash compensation eligible for forgiveness may not exceed an annual salary of $100,000 as prorated for the covered period. That prorated number is $15,835. Now, to be fair, that number might now be bigger based on the longer time. That is a correction. The slides are wrong. And you can count payroll costs that were both paid and incurred only once. Owners cannot be paid more on a prorated basis than they were in 2019. So if someone earned $50,000 in 2019, you cannot double their salary to $100,000 in 2020. Eligible non-payroll costs include covered mortgage obligations, that is payment of interest only, covered rent obligations, rent incurred during the time, and covered utility payments, and those include electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, or internet access. To be eligible, non-payroll costs must be paid during the covered period or incurred during the covered period. You can count non-payroll costs that were both paid and incurred only once. What can reduce your forgiveness? If your average FTE count during the period goes down, that will reduce your forgiveness. If you reduce your pay or your employees by more than 25%, that will reduce your forgiveness. In each of these instances, you need to work through complex calculations to determine how your forgiveness will be impacted. And we encourage this to do this with your CPA or advisor. It is quite complicated. Any positions for which the borrower made a good faith written offer to rehire an employee during the covered period, which was rejected by the employee, is an exemption. However, if you choose to take the longer time period, the 24 weeks, you have to make a good faith effort to replace that employee with somebody else. And if someone was fired for cause, voluntarily resigned, or voluntarily requested and received a reduction of their hours, that is an exemption for the reduction of FTE. And here, if you wish to, multifunding will be assisting borrowers for the process. If you wish to, you can reach out to us and we'll find a partner for you to do that. This webinar will be emailed to you and posted on our community site when we are done. And additional webinars will be announced as significant new information becomes available. Folks, I have until 4:30 Eastern time, about 15 minutes to take your questions. Bear with me. I'm sure you have a lot of specific questions that there aren't good answers to. And so when I keep telling you, I don't know, it's not that, please don't take it personally. It's just that there aren't good answers to that. And rather than guess or give you an incorrect answer, I think in most cases, the wise thing to do is wait and get the right guidance. Hannah, let's start with the questions. And one more question. I see people raising their hands. We will not be taking live Q&A. And I see people putting questions in the chat box. We're not taking questions from the chat box. We're taking all questions from the Q&A. So please proceed from there. Thank you.
Does this flexibility mean that I can spend what funds are left over towards the third month of payroll or payroll related costs, and these are eligible for forgiveness?
You can choose to do that. However, you will then commit to having your payroll and intact on December 31st or six months after, or 24 weeks after your period instead of 8 weeks. So you can do that. You can get more forgiven, but the trade-off is your payroll has to be intact on December 31st, as it reads right now.
Can a business owner stop taking pay in the forgiveness period and not have it impact the forgiveness calculation? The business owner's salary was used in the PPP application. The thought is that the salary could extend our runway and be used to pay employees.
I would check with your CPA, but your logic sounds right to me.
Do we need to wait for December 31st to apply for forgiveness? And do we have the option of selecting which date is used to meet the payroll requirements for forgiveness?
You have the option of choosing 8 weeks or 24 weeks. The way I understand it, if you choose 8 weeks, the date of your FTE exemption is June 30th. If you choose 24 weeks, the date that you can qualify for FTE exemption is up to December 30th. So what you have to figure out is if it's better off for you, based on how much you can get forgiven, to use the 8 weeks or the 24 weeks.
Is the relevant number for denominator, so full-time employee headcount on February 15th, or is it the average of the headcount for payroll period from Jan 1st to February 29th?
I'm not 100% sure, I'm sorry.
We have an employee in the National Guard, and he was summoned to Philadelphia due to the protest. He missed all but Monday for this week. How do we treat this in regards to employee headcount?
I don't know if I don't know how you pay him, if you pay him during that time, or if he gets paid for being in the National Guard during that time. I think that would be something to check with your CPA, or with the National Guard about. I'm sure there's a workaround for it. I just don't know how to do it. I'm sorry.
If a company opts for the 24-week forgiveness period, can it shut down before the 24-week ends and still have the loan forgiven? We expect to use all of our PPP loan on salaries over the course of 11 weeks. From that point on, we don't expect to be able to stay in business.
I'm sorry for your situation, but if you don't expect to be paid in business, it doesn't much matter if your loan gets forgiven or written off.
If we sell our company in the middle of the forgiveness period, what is the impact?
It's a question I was asked today, and it's going to come up in guidance, and I don't know if it's transferable or not. I have no idea how that works. And we're going to have to get guidance about that, and that could take some time.
To be clear, only loans issued after today are payable in 5 years, or all loans payable in 5 years?
Only loans today are after today are automatically payable in 5 years. If you would like to try get your current PPP loan moved to a 5-year amortization instead of a 2-year amortization, you have to try work with your lender to find a mutually agreeable solution to that.
Can we spend 100% of PPP on eligible payroll expenses?
Yes.
On the 24-week period, are they calculating the average must be equal to the original average of the 10-week period?
We're going to have to wait for further guidance on that. I'm sorry.
I have multiple business locations listed in my one PPP loan. One of them will likely close. How can I still get forgiveness if we no longer have the same need for full-time employees due to the business closing?
Again, I think, I'm sorry that your one location will close. I think part of that depends how much of your payroll was on that one location versus the other ones. And I think that's a scenario you need to work out with your CPA or bookkeeper or advisor to look at some different scenarios. It's hard for me to answer that question without knowing the relative proportions.
There's many questions on the 8-week versus 24-week. Are they exclusively? And what if our funds are exhausted in 12 weeks or another amount X? Can we file before the 24 weeks are done?
It's a good question. In some respects, I couldn't imagine why, if you're not 100% forgiven at that point, why you couldn't do that. But I've seen less rational things. So guidance will tell, but in principle, you should be able to.
Will payroll administration fees to a payroll provider be allowable?
No.
Does the PPP forgiveness cover office HOA payments?
We don't think so.
If you take an SBA EIDL loan, not the grant, does that reduce the loan amount for MSLP?
If you take an EIDL as it relates to MSLP, the question then is how the lien of the EIDL works. You might, and what MSLP facility you're getting. you're trying to get a priority MSLP facility, it is likely that you will have to refinance the EIDL into that facility. If you're trying to get a new facility, that will depend upon whether the SBA will be willing to give up some of its rights to you in light of bankruptcy, and that's all to be determined.
I sold my business in February, but my PPP was based on the average payroll of the previous 12 months. Can I now use the total I was given on payroll for the remaining 2 employees through December 30th?
I don't quite understand what that question means vis-a-vis you selling your business. Sorry.
What about workers' comp insurance premiums? Are they considered a payroll expense?
We don't think so.
In the earlier version, rent over 2 months was able to be included in allowable expenses. With the 24-week cover period, can we spend the money on 6 months of rent?
You can, but remember that if you use under 60, if you use anything more than up to a max of 40%, but if your forgiveness application is for less than 60% on payroll, the whole thing will be denied as forgivable.
If we received a PPP before the bill passed, can we use that on the original 8-week period and full-time employees as of June 30th, i.e. not have to maintain the same full-time employees until December 31st, as long as we meet all the previous provisions, the 75-25 split, etc.?
My understanding is that that's fine, and it's at your discretion whether to pick the 8 or the 24.
If an individual is an employee of 2 separate companies, which both receive PPP loans and are under common ownership, can both companies include the employee's salary if their forgiveness calculation up to $100K per year?
I don't think so. I think they can only be paid once.
So I now need to keep everyone employed until December 30th to be fully forgiven. Is that correct?
I believe that is the case I believe that is the case if you choose the 24-month period. Now, what's not clear, interestingly enough, is if you lay them off, say, from October through December and then bring them back on December 31st, then, and that might be a loophole that I'm sure they'll find a way around. But as I understand the rules now, that would be eligible. So it depends when your 24-month period ends and then what the payroll is on December 31st. I don't believe it's consistently through the period.
For Safe Harbor, I want to apply for forgiveness prior to December 31st. Can I show my FTE is back prior to the starting date?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think if you're going to use the Safe Harbor exception, you have to apply and prove that that's what happens on December 31st.
So to clarify, do we have 10 months to apply for forgiveness?
That's how I understand the rules.
And
10 months from the date that you took the loan.
Can you reduce FTE after the PPP is covered period?
I think after the Safe Harbor exemption, you can do whatever you want.
A pay reduction due to relocation to a different state that ends up being more than 25%. Will the company need to adjust for this individual? State taxes.
I think you will, but that's something I would definitely check with your CPA.
Can payroll taxes paid after start of covered period be included in the relate if they relate to prior quarter? So it's paid but not incurred?
No. I am almost positive that's not the answer. That have to be paid for the time that the period is covered. And remember, it's the employer payroll tax part that is covered. The employee part is not covered.
Do we know for sure that the amount limit will be increased? What?
I don't understand your question.
Yes, me neither, sorry. If we chose 24-week period and use the entire loan for payroll, will it all be forgiven?
It should be, as long as your FTE count and payroll count calibrate to what they were on February 15th.
If employee made 20K in 2019 and in 2020 it's increased to 100K, is that not allowed?
I believe, I'm almost positive. Well, if that's an owner, it's definitely not allowed. If it's an employee, I think it is allowed, but I would check with your CPA on that.
What is the effect on the payroll cap?
There's no effect on the payroll cap.
The
No
eligible,
effect on the, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
There's no effect on the payroll cap vis-a-vis $100,000 per person. There is an effect on the payroll cap that instead of it being 75, it can now be 60% if you elect the 24-week period.
Is Zoom an eligible utility for forgiveness because it has become essential in the past few months?
Question is, do the people who write these rules know what Zoom is? I don't know.
The eligible wages doesn't include the employee FICA portion. Please clarify.
That's correct. Guys, just to let you know, unfortunately, I have a hard stop at 4:30 for a commitment with the press. So we're about to take one more question and then we're going to have to go. So Hannah, make it a good one that I can try answer.
Now I'm nervous. Is the max forgiveness still the loan amount?
Correct.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for your time. Sorry if we couldn't get to all your questions today. We will post a recording of this webinar. Do remind you that we have a community site up at realtime.inc.com where you can post your questions and also give answers if you have insight to other members of the community. We wish you well, and when there are significant updates, we will be back to you with another webinar. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a good weekend. Take care.